I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce Senator Claire Moore to you. She is the Shadow Minister for International Development in the Pacific. And she's not, of course, a stranger to this conference. Many of you would know her from her attendance at earlier ACFID conferences. Senator Moore assumed her role as Labor Senator for Queensland in 2001 and has served as Shadow Minister for International Development and the Pacific since July 2016. She's also Deputy Chair of the Australian Parliamentary Group on Population Development and an active member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. Senator Moore has been champion of the Sustainable Development Goals and, with Senator Wong, initiated the current Senate inquiry looking into Australia's uptake of the goals, which will report later in November. As many of you will know, Senator Moore has announced she's retiring from Parliament at the next election. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Senator Moore for her commitment to the international development portfolio. As I just mentioned, Senator Moore has been almost a fixture at ACFID conferences over the past few years, and we would welcome her back in the future, whatever her role. But we certainly welcome her now to address you this afternoon. Thank you, Senator Moore.
Hello everyone, and it's always hard to get you back from lunch, but I'll try. And before I start, I always share in the acknowledgement of the traditional owners, and I pay my respects to elders of all cultures. I will disappoint you because this will not be an election speech and it will not be an outlining of all our international development promises for the election. That will be happening over the next few months. So if you want to turn off now, if that's what you're hoping for, I thought I'd warn you at the start. Right. Now, it was really interesting because we heard two fabulous speeches this morning and both of them touched on things I'm going to mention, so it was not pre-planned. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN General Assembly in December 1948. That's 70 years ago. Article 1 begins with the words, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." And its opening sentence recognises that the inherent dignity of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. 67 years later, don't even think it was the same building, but it was the same organisation leading into the United Nations, we had the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. In its preamble it says, and I quote, "We are determined to take the bold steps which are urgently needed to shift the world onto a sustainable and resilient path. We pledge to leave no one behind." They seek to realise the human rights of all and to achieve gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. Now, paragraph 8 of this preamble, we envision a world of universal respect for human rights and human dignity. We respect the law, justice, equality and non-discrimination, respect for race, ethnicity and cultural diversity, and of equal opportunity, permitting the full realisation of human potential and contributing to shared potential in our world. Neither of these two very significant declarations just popped up. Years of dedicated commitment, hard work and negotiation led to the particular wordings of these statements. Meetings, committees, and at least in the 21st century, lots of emails. And both of these statements, which are based on human rights, are a call to action. This conference reaffirms the clear link, the ongoing challenges and the very real need to remember our history and learn from the past. Now, when I think about our human rights commitment, I don't channel Eleanor Roosevelt And I don't even really challenge Jessie Street, but she has always been an inspiration. Some people in this group would be old enough to remember that not only was she a fighter and a strong woman and an advocate, but she even had a song written about her by another very great woman called Judy Small. Does anyone remember that wonderful song that Judy Small wrote about Jessie, which was an inspiration for me? It's something that I'm kind of hoping that people will look up and remember after this process, because Jessie was the only Australian woman who went to the 1945 San Francisco conference, which was the precursor of the work that was done on the Charter for Human Rights and also setting up the format for what we know of the United Nations. She was a woman from civil society. I'm not quite sure whether they used the term NGO back then in the 1920s and 30s, but if they did, she belonged to it. And she never stopped working in this space because she wanted and was committed to having people from the community involved with working with governments and with organisations to ensure that we had a just society. She was challenged by the need to look at injustice and how we could make a difference. She was also a candidate for the seat of Wentworth, and you know we could never have too many of them. But in terms of the process, she was active in politics and thought that the political sphere was a place where women should be active. In fact, when the centenary of her birth was celebrated at the other place, the University of Sydney, they talked about a woman whose life was well spent. And we're very, very fortunate because at the wonderful National Library, they have Jessie's papers, inches of diaries, statements, letters to the editor, and very wonderfully, we have recordings of radio interviews that she did from the time she first became active in politics and in social justice. And it's great to hear her voice talking about what she felt was important. Now, during the 1945 conference, she joined with a very small number of women. We heard that fabulous speech earlier that Sanam gave us about the way the women worked together. But at that 45 conference, there weren't too many women who were at that conference, and they didn't all agree, which is another kind of presumption that often happens. Just because you are of one gender, you think the same. But she joined with them to ensure that women's voices were heard in those debates. They did not always agree, but they actually had an absolute commitment to the sense that we would have in the wording of the opening statement. You know, when I read about how the declaration started, in the original draft of that statement that was considered leading up to the announcement in 1948, that wonderful statement about people being together started with the words, "All men are brothers." Now, the women felt that possibly didn't reflect all the people who would be impacted by the statement. So in terms of the process, whilst a lot of the things that these women worked for over the years didn't get up, a couple of key things did happen. And I think the wording of that statement is one, if nothing else, we should celebrate into the future. They also ensured that women could work equally in the United Nations setup, that there would be conditions of service that would encourage men and women to work together in this centre for human rights. And I think that's something we can continue to think about today because we haven't achieved everything that we wanted to, but nonetheless, this was enshrined at the start. She also worked very hard to ensure that there was a commission for the status of women within the structure. It wasn't set up originally the way that people would hope. It didn't have equal status. It was quite limited and poorly resourced. A little bit like UN Women in some ways, but nonetheless, in terms of how we move to the future, there was established in the structure a commission on the status of women so that they were able to ensure that women's voices again were heard. Now, not everything they wanted was put in place at the start, and it was not until 1979, 30 years later, that the International Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women was adopted, guaranteeing women equal rights with men in regard to nationality, irrespective of marriage. They were two proposals that Jessie had put on the table in 1947. Now, one of the things I like most in the diaries, and if you get a chance, have a look at them, there's a fabulous quote from Jessie, and her speeches are recorded, where she's talking about how she was discussing with the Australian group about these very issues in 1947. And she said, and I quote, "I told Mr. Ford and I told other members of the committee what we were going to do." Now remember, 47, a member of a group, the only woman, she advised the leaders of the Australian delegation what was going to happen. And I think that reflected her confidence and also the respect with which she was held. So another one of her core issues was around the very real issue of violence against women. But it wasn't until 1993 that gender-based violence was treated as a serious human rights issue at the World Conference on Human Rights, and soon after, the General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, leading into almost immediately after that, the wonderful Beijing Women's Conference. And I was lucky enough to be there, and I think it will always be a memory for me. And even when I was there, I was thinking that Jessie would have definitely been in her element at that conference. Now, I believe that the messages that Jessie gave to us early in the last century are just as real to us today as they were at the time. Now, this conference is focusing on the issues around human rights, and we know that the government is committed to human rights. In fact, we're dripping in human rights in this country. But I think just for the sake that this is an ACFID conference, it's worthwhile referring to the white paper that came out, which is our Bible, and I'm sure there's people here who almost have it with them. They carry it around, the 2017 white paper that was released by DFAT. A whole segment of that white paper leading into it talks about the commitment of human rights and how Australia values human rights and will develop our policies around those issues. In the voluntary national review of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I've made a little bit of a personal commitment to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals no matter where I speak. It can get a little confusing for people when I'm at community events, but nonetheless, I always manage to throw in at least one goal just to keep the conversation going. But in the voluntary national review of the Sustainable Development Goals, there is a very important statement at the beginning of our voluntary national review, and I'm going to read it because I think it should be turned into a T-shirt, and it talks about our commitment to the human rights aspect. And she says, looking desperately for her notes, here we are. The SDGs reflect things that Australians value highly and seek to protect, like a healthy environment, access to opportunity and services, human rights, inclusive economies, diverse and supportive communities, and our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and heritage. Our support for political, economic and religious freedoms, liberal democracy, the rule of law, equality and mutual respect underpin a strong, fair and cohesive society. Core to the Australian understanding of the SDGs is the Australian value of a fair go. Like leaving no one behind, it is a call to action for fairness, justice and equality of opportunity. So this indicates that those messages that we had in 1948, then when the Sustainable Development Goals agenda was endorsed by the Australian government on behalf of all of us, and now in our first voluntary review, underpinning the commitments is the human rights agenda. So, we heard earlier that there is now a Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade inquiry into the SDGs. And what people are asking through that inquiry is what happens next. We've had our voluntary review and so many people in this room and the organisations which you represent have been integrally involved in looking at our engagement in the SDG agenda. And a few things are actually coming up now in terms of key themes. One of the most important things is the fact that people want to have their voices heard in this discussion. We know there were consultative processes put in place by the department leading up to the voluntary response, but we're hearing consistently through the inquiry that people want to be heard. And I'm going to just mention a couple just to make the example. And one is the issue of people with disabilities. And we heard from a number of people representing groups of people with disabilities that bring direct experience into our national engagement. Children and young people with disabilities and people's organisations have a clear commitment to the relevance of the SDGs and to the real concept of leaving no one behind. That's been reflected in our international development program through the Development for All 2015-20 process, which I know people are involved in. But again, people with disabilities themselves want to be in that process, they want to be engaged, and they want that to continue in a systemic way as we move beyond this first voluntary review. I couldn't help thinking when we heard the previous contributions this morning about the issues around gender equality. Now, I don't know how happy Jessie would be to see SDG 5, the specialised agenda for women. Of course, she'd want to see women involved, but to see the issues of poverty, equal pay, education, violence, all still on the agenda 70 years after she wanted those things included in the original process. I don't know whether that would lead to hope or frustration or that very strong anger which Jessie could show at times, but nonetheless the need is still there. And we heard that magnificent contribution this morning about women, peace and justice. And consistently, in 1947, so close to the end of World War II, the issue of women as peacemakers, not just being the victims of conflict, but being the influencers and the activists to make change to ensure peace, was on the agenda in 1947. Now, in 2018, we heard this morning about the ongoing challenges across our globe, and we need to ensure that people like the wonderful Australian Civil Society Coalition on Women, Peace and Security, who are challenging our community to what can be done with the future plans, which we heard about, but also to me bring up the images that are seen in the images of 1930s through 1947 in this fabulous book about Jessie Street, the images of women standing together, having gone to meetings talking about peace and how women internationally can achieve peace. They were the United Associations of Women, which Jessie was deeply involved in, that brought women together to have their views heard. These views were put to governments. They were put to governments in the 40s, they were put to governments consistently through the last century, and they're being put to governments now. So the legacy, the importance, the call to action is to have those voices heard so that we can truly respond to this Sustainable Development Goal agenda. Now, I ask people whether they have hope. I do that because I need to have hope when you're having all these issues around what we need to change in our world. And consistently, people who come to our Senate inquiry say they are hopeful. They are hopeful that there can be change. And I wanted to end this contribution today with something that I consider is almost like having an injection of medication, because a couple of weeks ago I went to Forest Primary School in Canberra, and I was bombarded with questions by 70 11-year-olds who, possibly not voluntarily, were encouraged to look at the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. And in terms of these kids and their knowledge, their passion, their research around the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, where they saw it operating now, and where they saw themselves and their families in the future. Now remember, they're 11 years old in 2018. When the agenda concludes, and I no doubt there'll be another agenda after that, but when this particular series of goals and indicators are finalised, they will be 26 years old. To me, still quite young, but nonetheless, 26 years old. They will be shaping policy. They'll be determining where our world will go. And it's incredibly important, I think, to see and to guide and to listen to those voices, because they are keen and they are talking about the issues and they want to make change. If I could translate that passion and knowledge into Australia's Parliament, I could be a really, really fulfilled human being. But I'm trying now to see whether I can actually ensure that the Forest Grade 6, I'm not sure whether that's what they call it in the ACT, whether their voices will be part of our Sustainable Development Goals inquiry. So we'll be able to have them on evidence, challenging us about how we are going to be active and challenging us to ensure that the work that Jessie Street did through the 1920s and 30s about women's pay and equity, through the 1940s about developing a true agenda within our community around peace and justice and equality, whether those words will be able to be translated into effective policy and be a genuine call to action, not just words on the paper. So when I go back to Forest School, I'm going to take, hopefully, some form of technology. I used to have a record of Judy Small, but I don't think there's any turntables left. But nonetheless, I'm going to take a heroine of mine along so that they can hear about the work of Jessie Street. And I'm going to quote Judy Small's wonderful words. "And Jessie, your example helps us all along the way. Foundations that were laid back then, we're building on today. And the struggle isn't over. There are mountains still to climb, but the legacy you and your sisters left is our lifetime. You're an inspiration to the women of your time, and Jessie Street, you'll always be a heroine of mine." Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to acknowledge Claire's tireless activism. She's one of these wonderful women of the Labor left that came into politics from being a community activist and was very involved in helping set up Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation in Queensland. She's continued to be an activist in her parliamentary career, whether it's for greater engagement between Australians and the peoples of different countries in Africa through the parliamentary inquiry in 2010. She was, of course, a key champion of the previous Labor government's commitment to 0.5 of gross national income for aid. And as you've just heard, she is also been the driving force in getting this parliamentary inquiry in the Senate up on Australia's commitment to the SDGs. So, Claire, I know Jessie is your hero, but I think that respect for history that you have for activists who have come before you, I think you're an inspiration to a whole current generation to come. So, yeah, and 11-year-olds. So thank you very much. A big warm round of applause. Thanks to Senator Claire Moore.